Hello everyone. Welcome back to our channel. This video presents a critical examination of global governance systems throughout history, highlighting how governments, politicians, and oligarchs have throughout history consistently failed humanity through wars, exploitation, and self-serving policies. We'll analyze the historical failures of both US-style democracy and Chinese authoritarianism, arguing that neither model serves the interests of humanity as a whole. The video warns of an emerging technological arms race between the US and China to develop artificial superintelligence, ASI, and quantum computing capabilities, which could lead to unprecedented global risks if these powerful technologies remain under the control of competing superpowers or profit-driven tech oligarchs and corporations. As an alternative, in this video we propose a new global governance framework called the United Human Organization. This would be a private, citizen-funded organization representing all nations and cultures, not controlled by governments. It would leverage blockchain technology for transparent voting and oversight, and would develop benevolent ASI to guide global affairs according to collective human values rather than narrow national or corporate interests. We envision how these technologies, properly governed through a global citizens initiative, could bring about unprecedented benefits, eradicating diseases, extending lifespans, solving climate change, optimizing resource distribution, and creating material abundance for all humanity. We conclude by emphasizing that the future of humanity depends on choosing collaborative governance of these powerful technologies rather than allowing them to be controlled by competing power blocks. This video is in 3 parts. Part 1 is titled, The Failure of Current Global Governance. It provides an analysis of historical governance failures, documentation of wars, conflicts, regime changes, how superpowers and corporations exploit other nations. Part 2 is titled, The Emerging Technological Threats and Opportunities. This includes the rise of the technolords, the US-China technological arms race, the unprecedented risks of ASI under competitive control. Part 3 is titled, The United Human Organization, a New Framework for Global Governance. It has the detailed proposal for the United Human Organization structure, how blockchain, ASI, and quantum computing would work together, the potential benefits of properly governed technology, and vision of the utopian possibilities. So, let's begin our journey with Part 1, the failure of current global governance. Imagine our world is run by artificial superintelligence entities, or ASI as it is called, and not governments and corporations. Imagine that nations no longer need governments to run affairs because ASI entities can govern far more fairly and efficiently. They can govern hundreds of times more efficiently than inept, selfish, and often corrupt governments run by humans who are prone to frequently making huge and devastating blunders. The present national and global governance structures were designed for an earlier era and struggle to address modern complex, transnational challenges. Meanwhile, technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing are advancing at unprecedented rates, creating both extraordinary opportunities and existential risks. We need governance frameworks sophisticated enough to harness perhaps these last human inventions, as AI is all set to outperform human intelligence, some say within the next decade, if not sooner. History has proven over and over again that national governments work for their own national interests, often without much regard for humanity as a whole. The tribal human mentality has not changed despite our evolution from caves to cities. Our thinking is still tribal, even though we have grown into nations consisting of millions of people, from ancient tribes consisting of just 75 to 100 people at most. Our loyalty to our nations is no different than the loyalty of our ancestors to their small tribe. We are conditioned to only consider the lives of our tribe mates as important, and other nations are looked upon as non-humans, with their lives less important. Governments run by monarchs, military dictators, politicians, and oligarchs prey on this tribal behavior to control their subjects and protect their own personal vested interests. Throughout human history, they have led their tribes, now nations, into wars and conflicts. Sometimes religious motivations have fueled conflicts, such as the Crusades, and many times it is territorial expansion and cultural domination. You can trace this back to countless military campaigns, from Alexander's conquests to the Roman, Islamic, and European expansion through wars, battles, and colonial conflicts. The European colonization of Australia resulted in the systematic dispossession and decimation of Aboriginal peoples through frontier violence, disease, and deliberate policies aimed at eliminating indigenous cultures. Similarly, the Spanish conquest sanctioned by the Spanish Queen Isabella and led by Hernán Cortés devastated the Aztec and Maya civilizations through warfare, disease, and cultural suppression, while in North America, the expansion of European settlements led to the forced displacement and decimation of Native American tribes through events like the Trail of Tears and battles such as Wounded Knee. These patterns of ethnic cleansing and racial subjugation underpin human nature and its compulsion of conflicts across continents and eras, from the Battle of Blood River in South Africa in 1838 to colonial conquests worldwide. It is a clear demonstration of how the drive for territorial, religious, and cultural dominance has repeatedly led to the marginalization and elimination of indigenous peoples and minority groups throughout human history. We would have hoped that the 20th century would start off on a peaceful note. After all, humans had become more civilized, or at least it seemed from the way in which cities were developing and well-lit. But human nature could not resist conflicts and violence. World War I, which began in 1914 and lasted for 4 years, emerged from a complex web of territorial ambitions, nationalistic fervor, and imperial competition, with battles like Verdun and the Somme exemplifying the devastating human cost. Millions of souls perished, and the economies of warring nations and livelihoods of many more millions of their citizens came to a standstill. In 1939, World War II saw these elements intensified through racial ideology, with the Nazi regime's quest for living space and racial dominance leading to unprecedented destruction across Europe and the Pacific, including the battles of Stalingrad and Normandy. An estimated 70 to 85 million people died during World War II, making it the deadliest conflict in human history, with a significant portion of those deaths being civilians who had nothing to do with the decisions to go to war. Some historians blame two leaders, or rulers, Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, for the financial collapse of the entire continent. This collapse was so monumental that beyond going financially bankrupt, Europe lost most of its childbearing youth and now have a negative overall population growth rate. In the East, Japan inflicted unprecedented casualties on China and its other neighboring countries just to suffer a total collapse of its own civilization in the end. Some experts predict that the Japanese culture, including the Japanese language, will disappear into the wells of history within the next 50 years, since Japan has the lowest birth rate in the world. World War II virtually cost the once formidable and admired Japanese empire their entire centuries-old civilization and culture. The ancestors of Japanese people had carefully nurtured their civilization and culture with immense sacrifices and hard work, but a small number of ambitious Japanese generals and politicians blew it all away. Or shall we say it was blown to smithereens in seconds by just 2 nuclear bombs. One would think that after World War II, leaders of nations would have learned their lesson of entering into reckless conflicts. In the Second World War, several empires were obliterated. The British, French, Italians, and the Japanese had lost most of their youth. The lesson from the war was loud and clear, that attempts to resolve conflicts through military means cause unnecessary misery and tremendous loss of life. But once again, humanity's insatiable appetite for wealth and power prevailed over better judgment. In this century, the 2003 invasion of Iraq stands as a stark illustration of how easily a superpower with unwise leadership, aided by ethically deficient and compromised mainstream media channels, can manipulate world opinion to pursue hidden objectives. Under the false pretense that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, a claim later proven entirely fabricated, the United States launched a war that resulted in hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths, destabilized an entire region, and decimated a society with ancient cultural roots. The real motivation, many scholars and analysts have concluded, centered on securing access to Iraq's vast oil reserves and establishing strategic military presence in the Middle East. Despite worldwide protests and insufficient evidence, sophisticated media campaigns with the collaboration of mainstream media and carefully crafted intelligence narratives swayed enough international opinion to enable a devastating military campaign against Iraq. The consequences for USA of this blunder are still being felt 21 years after the invasions. USA lost $6 trillion in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, and went from a once respected sole superpower with a $500 billion in surplus to a controversial, untrustworthy, and near bankrupt and confused empire with over $36 trillion in national debt. Now imagine if those $6 trillion had been spent to uplift the living standards of American citizens and modernize the national infrastructure. Moreover, a portion of that would have been enough to provide free higher education, housing, and health benefits to all Americans for years to come. But all that great opportunity was lost due to bad decisions by a few small-minded and selfish humans running USA affairs. According to well-renowned geopolitical scientists and global economic experts like Jeffrey Sachs, Noam Chomsky, Richard Wolff, Robert Fisk, Robert Reich, Yanis Varoufakis, Chris Hedges, David Frum, and countless others. The once respected sole superpower, USA, might be on the brink of losing its unipolar global power and influence, and our world might be entering a bipolar era with China, Russia, and perhaps a conglomerate of other collectively wielding equal or even more power. What's interesting to note is that just as the European empire's collapse was caused by a handful of individuals, and we name Winston Churchill and Hitler among the leading figures, the American empire's current woes can be attributed to a handful of American politicians, key figures, and oligarchs. Notable among these is the 43rd President of the United States, George Bush Jr., his Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and other so-called hawks like Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Richard Pearl, John Bolton, William Kristol, Bob Kagan on the intellectual side, and Max Boot. Most of these individuals held influential positions in the Bush administration and pushed for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a war that inflicted irreparable damage and wounds to the USA economy, prestige, and stature as the most admired and progressive nation in modern history, if not the entire history of our civilization. The ease with which such false propaganda could be leveraged to justify the destruction of an entire nation raises chilling questions about how similar tactics might be employed in an era of even more powerful technologies. Mass-scale propaganda has been a tool used by governments, especially from the early 20th century, to manufacture consent. Adolf Hitler used it effectively to rally the German citizens behind him to wage wars and also persecute Jews living in Germany and Poland. Several million innocent Jews were murdered by Hitler. Similarly, Jews and Gypsies in Russia faced the same fate as Stalin used mass propaganda to support his murders. The most recent example of mainstream media's unethical role in fanning conflicts is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. This represents a stark case where religious claims, territorial control, and cultural tensions have resulted in genocide by Israel of the unprotected and totally vulnerable Palestinian people. This indifference to the plight of Palestinians has reached such an abhorring level that real estate tycoons in the West have already started promotional campaigns to build resorts and golf courses on occupied territories of the totally helpless and beleaguered Palestinian people, while at the same time, USA-made bombs, missiles, and death is constantly punishing even children and infants in the same war-stricken territories where these resorts and golf courses are shamelessly being proposed. The irony is that all this is happening despite the United Nations organization having passed numerous resolutions supporting Palestinian statehood and refugee rights, from Resolution 181, 1947, recommending partition, to Resolution 194, 1948, affirming refugee rights, Resolution 3236, 1974, reaffirming Palestinian self-determination, and more recent measures upgrading Palestine's status. Yet these formal declarations stand in stark contrast to the reality on the ground, where Palestinians continue to face displacement, occupation, and systematic denial of their internationally recognized rights. This glaring disparity between proclamation and practice represents perhaps the most damning indictment of contemporary global governance structures. The United Nations was established following the end of World War II. The organization was created to promote international peace and prevent future conflicts on the scale of the two world wars. The UN Charter was signed by 51 founding member states at the San Francisco Conference on June 26, 1945, and officially came into existence when it was ratified by the required number of nations, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Today, the UN has grown to include 193 member states, but has miserably failed to accomplish its mission of maintaining international peace and security and promoting social progress and human rights. This original video is a reminder of how far United Nations has strayed from its charter.
Here in the midst of war, the world's people collaborated in the drafting of a workable international constitution. It was a conference to write a people's charter, opening with the words, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind."
Many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war.
This charter points the way, but whether the world is to move in that direction will depend finally upon the vigilance and sovereign will of the peoples of the world.
The very superpower that championed the UN's formation and its binding charter, which explicitly mandates maintaining international peace, upholding international law, and promoting universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction, has repeatedly wielded its veto power to shield its regional ally from accountability while providing billions in military aid that enables continued violations. When one reads the full UN Charter, which reads as, the UN Charter mandates the UN and its member states to maintain international peace and security, uphold international law, achieve higher standards of living for their citizens, address economic, social, health, and related problems, and promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. As a charter and constituent treaty, its rules and obligations are binding on all members and supersede those of other treaties. There you have it. Any sane person observing what is going on with the millions of Palestinian people in the Middle East would immediately recognize the profound disconnect between the UN Charter's binding obligations and the reality on the ground. The Charter's clear mandates to maintain peace, uphold international law, and ensure universal human rights stand in stark contrast to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Palestine, where civilians face bombardment, displacement, and severe restrictions on basic necessities. This glaring contradiction exposes not just a failure of enforcement, but a fundamental breakdown in the international order, where selective application of principles has rendered the most basic protections meaningless for an entire population. The Palestinian crisis illuminates a disturbing truth about our global governance system. The entire framework stands fundamentally compromised, a hollow structure where noble principles are consistently sacrificed at the altar of raw power. International organizations meant to uphold justice have devolved into theaters of empty symbolism, where resolutions pile up without enforcement and humanitarian concerns bow before geopolitical calculations. This profound contradiction between the lofty ideals enshrined in charters and the brutal realities on the ground reveals a system paralyzed by power politics, where strategic alliances consistently override legal and moral imperatives. What makes this failure particularly chilling is its implications for our collective future. Today, it is Palestinians enduring this systemic abandonment, but tomorrow larger populations could face similar indifference when their suffering becomes inconvenient to global powers. When the world's most powerful nations can ignore with impunity the very rules they established and championed, raises existential questions about whether our international institutions and global governance system, as currently constructed, is compatible with humanity anymore, and whether it can ever fulfill their foundational promise of creating a more just and peaceful world order. Serious questions are being raised as to why the international organizations are tools of the powerful and are deployed selectively to maintain an unjust status quo while providing the comforting illusion of moral governance. Not all evil plans of expansion and hegemony have used military force and weapons. The tactic of instigating regime changes using pre-planted economic hitmen, provoking civil unrest and civil wars to weaken other nations and maintain control of vast territories with valuable resources, has been employed for centuries. The colonial empires habitually used a divide-and-rule strategy and instigated civil unrest to rule over vast territories, using indigenous front men and women as their representative rulers. The modern form of this practice is regime change operations conducted by superpowers like the USA and Russia. According to one study, the U.S. performed at least 81 overt and covert known interventions in foreign elections from 1946 to 2000. According to another study, the U.S. engaged in 64 covert and 6 overt attempts at regime change during the Cold War. Similarly, Russia has engaged in several regime change operations as well. These interventions have catastrophic consequences beyond the immediate political shifts. They destroy infrastructure, economies, and social fabrics of already vulnerable nations, pushing them deeper into poverty and debt traps. The ensuing instability creates humanitarian crises, forcing millions to flee their homelands and seek asylum in developed countries, thereby triggering immigration challenges that fuel xenophobia and right-wing extremism in host nations. The destruction of functioning institutions leaves power vacuums often filled by extremist groups, creating new security threats. Meanwhile, the targeted populations suffer generational trauma, economic devastation, and the loss of cultural heritage and national sovereignty. Once these nations are exposed, organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, or IMF as it is known, the World Bank, and other parasitic institutions are launched to prey on the carcass of these countries, stripping them of valuable resources and enslaving them in debt for generations. IMF extends debt to a beleaguered nation partially or solely to increase political leverage of its influencers, or those who fund the IMF. And guess who is the largest contributor? The United States, of course. As the largest cumulative contributor to the IMF at $155 billion and the largest voting bloc, the U.S. has effective veto power for many decisions. This parasitic model of first creating chaos and then encircling the victim nations into a debt trap has typically worked in the following manner. After an orchestrated crisis has devastated the target nation, IMF extends excessive credit to that country with the intention of extracting economic or political concessions. The conditions of the loans are often extremely stringent and harsh on the citizens of the borrower nation and often not publicized. When the debtor country becomes unable to meet its repayment obligations, IMF demands structural adjustment programs and political alignment as instructed by its largest voting bloc. Moreover, a large portion of the borrowed money by the victim country is siphoned off by its corrupt elite class and makes it back to financial centers in the rich countries, while the remaining amount commonly pays for contractors and materials sourced from the major influencers in IMF. That is why these countries are unable to progress and forever remain in a circus of circular debt. Today, there are almost 93 countries owing money to IMF. The top 10 debtors' nations account for more than two-thirds, or almost 70%, of the outstanding balance. These countries are South Africa, Angola, Pakistan, Ukraine, Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, Ivory Coast, Egypt, and Nigeria. The most recent regime change operation was allegedly conducted in Pakistan on the 10th of April in 2022 to overthrow what many describe as a thriving and progressive government under Prime Minister Imran Khan, and replacing it with hand-picked officials whom critics characterize as corrupt because Pakistan was reportedly not following USA directives. These interventions, whether through economic sanctions, funding opposition groups, or information warfare, represent a modern form of imperialism that prioritizes geopolitical advantage over human welfare and international stability. Another instrument used by powerful countries, for example the United States, to influence elections and policy in poor countries is U.S. aid, which stands for U.S. Agency for International Development. Ironically, U.S. aid was originally formed in 1961 to extend assistance to countries recovering from disaster, trying to escape poverty, and engaging in democratic reforms. But over the course of the years, the agency has become a covert foreign policy instrument. For example, in 2014, U.S. aid was accused of secretly creating a Cuban Twitter called Zunzunio to stir unrest and undermine the Cuban government. In 2023, Mexico's president asked his U.S. counterpart, Joe Biden, to stop U.S. aid from funding groups hostile to the Mexican government, echoing previous Mexican criticism of U.S. interventionism. He claimed that the U.S. government, specifically through U.S. aid, has for some time been financing organizations openly against the legal and legitimate democratic government of Mexico. While the U.S. has long touted U.S. aid, in part, as strengthening young democracies, it has used U.S. aid to support friendly dictators and authoritarian regimes during the Cold War, including Taiwan, Pakistan, and South Korea when they were under military rule, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo under Mobutu Sese Seko. During the early years of the 21st century, when the United States was busy with its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, another emerging nation accelerated its pursuit towards becoming a superpower. This nation was no other than China, the largest trading partner of the U.S. and also the largest U.S. Treasury bonds buyer. So in essence, China was selling its goods to the U.S. and investing the sales proceeds in U.S. Treasury bonds. This debt to China amounted to trillions of dollars and provided the U.S. with money to keep the domestic economy wheels spinning, as well as money to finance the expensive wars. But once China surfaced as a formidable economic and military force, They made their move and initiated their devious plans for global hegemony. China's debt trap diplomacy in Central Asia started with the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. China's conceived a strategy of extending excessive loans to heavily indebted countries that cannot repay them, ultimately forcing these nations to surrender strategic assets to China through debt-for-equity swaps. By 2023, Central Asia's collective debt to China reached $15.7 billion, or 7.6% of the region's external debt. The impact varies significantly across countries. For example, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Pakistan have accumulated billions of dollars of Chinese debt. This has major strategic implications. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are most vulnerable to surrendering infrastructure if unable to repay. Potential Chinese control could include Kyrgyz power plants, transmission lines, roads, and Tajik gold and silver mines. This dependency threatens these nations' ability to maintain balanced foreign policies. Anti-Chinese sentiment has increased in the vulnerable countries, and critics warn about Chinese geopolitical expansion. China's loan policies will likely continue in Central Asia, with the ongoing Ukraine conflict providing further opportunities for Chinese economic expansion in the region. The rise of China began 2 decades ago while U.S. was busy in Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Now, China represents a significant challenge to U.S.-led international capitalism due to fundamental contradictions within the unilateral rules-based system imposed on the global order. While the U.S. neoliberal capitalist model shows signs of decline, marked by extreme inequality and increasing economic and political instability, China's socialist system continues to achieve near 5% annual growth. China has made remarkable progress in advanced technologies and manufacturing, as evidenced by recent breakthroughs from companies like DeepSeek in advanced AI. Over the past decade, China has successfully expanded its global influence and goodwill, while the U.S. focused on regime changes and conflicts across multiple regions, including the Middle East and Ukraine. Critics argue that China has strategically leveraged this opportunity through what we termed earlier as debt diplomacy, providing loans to nations unlikely to repay them, potentially to secure future political and alliance benefits. While concrete evidence of impropriety in these lending practices remains limited, risks exist, particularly if U.S. interference destabilizes debtor economies. In such scenarios, China might employ more assertive tactics to recover loans, with unpredictable consequences. U.S. national security strategists consistently warn that leadership in emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing will determine global dominance in the future. U.S. hawks perceive China's substantial investments and advancements in these fields as attempts to displace American primacy across economic, industrial, technological, military, and geopolitical domains. Let's now look at China's governance system. China has a single-party so-called benevolent dictatorial regime with a dismal record of human rights and freedom of speech. Even though China has successfully developed a large middle class in a short period, yet its internal machinery of governance is concealed from the rest of the world. What is known of China is that China has over 600 million cameras throughout the country watching the movement of people and automobiles, making China the most surveilled nation in the world. China has nuclear weapons and a large and advanced fighting force, comprising of a powerful navy, air force, and well-trained troops on the ground. The size of PLA, People's Liberation Army as China calls their force, is over 2 million active-duty personnel, of which approximately 1 million is their fighting force, making it the world's largest military. In recent years, China also has made tremendous progress in AI and quantum computing technology. Just recently, new large language models from China emerged that sent shockwaves in Silicon Valley. DeepSeek, a Chinese AI startup, has prompted a significant reckoning in the AI technology hubs worldwide, challenging the dominance of American AI giants and prompting discussions about the future of AI development, particularly regarding cost-effectiveness and open-source models. DeepSeek developed their DeepSeek reasoning model for a mere $5 million, whereas Google, Meta, and OpenAI spent between $150 million to $600 million on their equivalent models. In quantum computing, China is also at par with the U.S. China recently unveiled its most advanced quantum computer, the Tianyin 504, featuring a 504-qubit chip named Xiaohong. It reportedly surpasses Google's Willow chip in performance. It is safe to assume that the Chinese government will, and if not already has, incorporated advanced AI and quantum computing technologies into their defense programs, as well as citizen surveillance programs. Where all this leads to in the future is anyone's guess, but the chances of Chinese citizens being totally free, in the sense of true freedom of speech, freedom to protest, freedom to dissent, etc., are becoming bleaker by the day. This alone makes the Chinese model of governance incompatible with the rest of the world. The Chinese model of governance is too militaristic, too robotic, and may call it too suffocating. Chinese people may be used to it as they are born into it and have no choice but to accept it, but it is not compatible with the rest of the world. As far as China's hegemonic designs, China's debt trap diplomacy in Central Asia has been successful, and their Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is well underway. Do we see a future where many nations will be under China's direct influence, that is solidly in the Chinese camp? The answer is yes. Is this a matter of concern to Western powers, especially the US? The answer is yes. US is unwilling to accept the fact that many nations may slip out of US influence and align their interests and economies, including their currencies, with China. China is not a threat to the US in military terms, but China, once a welcome trading partner and largest US Treasury bonds client, is now being portrayed by US politicians as a rival that is challenging the unipolar superpower status of the US. This is causing tensions between the two nations, and we can expect the technology race, specifically in AI and quantum supremacy, to heat up, elevating threat levels. If provocations flamed by mostly Western politicians continue, we don't really know how China will react. Any misadventures by Western powers may lead to a war of the scale that the world has never seen. It might actually be the last war that mankind ever fights. We can only guess of the consequences. As we stand at the edge of a technological revolution, we cannot afford to be passive observers. The stakes are too high. We urge you, don't just stand by. Become aware. Educate others. Ask questions. Speak up. And, most importantly, join the global movement to ensure that the future of artificial superintelligence is benevolent and it belongs to all of humanity, not a handful of governments or corporations. The future is not something to wait for. It's something we must actively build together. This concludes Part 1. In Part 2, we'll explore the emerging technological threats and opportunities, examining how artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology are reshaping global power dynamics. We'll analyze why the entities that now control the majority of the compute infrastructure, talent, and have enormous financial resources create new vulnerabilities as they form alliances with politicians and the military establishment.